But today I titled my sermon, Don't Let Go. Don't let go. Last week, we talked about don't stop praying, the idea to keep going to God and to not give up, to be persistent in prayer and how God will move and will answer. And the week before that, Pastor Steve talked about how God can do anything. And he talked about the life of Abraham and Sarah, who were like too old to have kids. But God said, you're going to have a kid. And not only that, your family tree, your generations that will be coming from you will be too numerous to count. To go from being barren to having so many family members that it's more than the stars in the sky. And God had promised Abraham that through you and your descendants, the whole world will be blessed. So that's what we've been talking about over the past few weeks. So today I want to pick up in the story of Abraham's grandson. So Abraham, who wasn't supposed to have kids, had a child, or I should say Sarah and Abraham, who weren't supposed to have kids, had a child together. His name was Isaac. And then Isaac had kids, specifically twins. And that's where we're picking up our story today. So I titled this, Don't Let Go. We're talking about Abraham's grandson, Jacob. So of the two twins that were being born to Isaac and his wife, Jacob was technically the younger, the second twin to be born, as his brother is being born. And back then, there was a big deal on who was the oldest, who was the firstborn. So as twins were coming out, they would often tie a string around the baby that was coming out first to make sure that in the confusion they don't realize or don't remember which baby came out first. So as Jacob's brother Esau is being born, Jacob is born grabbing his heel, almost pulling him, almost like, I'm going to be born first. So he is given the name Jacob, which is a play on the Hebrew for heel or to grasp the heel or deceiver. So from his very birth, he has a very specific name, which is not uncommon in the Old Testament. A lot of people had names that were very significant to when they were born, where they were born, how they were born, or something of that nature. Whereas today, we generally just often pick names that we like, or maybe a family tie. But in Old Testament times, the name was very significant and related to the situation regarding birth often. So Jacob, from his very first moments on earth, was given this name of deceiver, was given this name of supplanter, of grasping the heel. And as he continued throughout his life, that story kind of followed him. He was technically the second-born, and his brother was the firstborn. As the firstborn, his brother would have gotten to be in charge of the family when the father died. His brother would have also gotten a double share of the inheritance, so it was a big deal. Well, one day his brother was out hunting and came back really hungry, and Jacob basically tricked him out of his birthright. He said, I'll make you a stew. I know you're really hungry. I'll make you this stew if you, in turn, give me your birthright. So his brother did. He must have been really famished. So Jacob had been tricking his brother. Then later on, when he was a bit older and his father was getting ready to die, Jacob, with his mother, tricked their father into giving him the familial blessing that should have been given to Esau. So throughout his life, Jacob had been scheming and working to try and accomplish things kind of in his own strength, not necessarily in the most godly, upright way. So that is our story. That is the story of Jacob. As Jacob keeps getting older, he becomes very wealthy, doing very well in life, very successful, has a lot of animals, and he hears that his brother is coming to see him. Now, this is the same brother that he tricked twice in the past, and his parents are no longer alive, so the general thing that would have happened then is when Esau sees Jacob, he would have had him killed, because the parents weren't around to say, hey, don't kill your brother. So that is what Jacob was suspecting was going to happen. So Jacob takes great plans to get his family, all his children, his wives, his flocks, his herds, all of those together, and sends them on, sends kind of like a peace offering to meet his brother. Before they come face to face, he's sending gifts to kind of soften his brother up, hoping that maybe his brother won't be super mad, maybe his brother won't want to kill him. So Jacob sends all his family on ahead, and he is spending the night alone in prayer with God. That's where we pick up our story. We are in Genesis 32, starting in verse 24. It says, "So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak." So just one verse. This story is a common story from Old Testament times, Jacob wrestling with someone. Now in this verse, it calls this someone a man. We're going to see how that changes a bit. Jacob is about 97 years old at this time. I'm not 97, but I imagine that wrestling at the age of 97 would be pretty hard to do. So Jacob is left alone and wrestled with a man till daybreak. So a 97-year-old is wrestling all night with this guy, or with this man, as the Bible says. So this isn't just a physical wrestling, because a 97-year-old, even in Bible times, couldn't wrestle all night. So this is a special type of wrestling. There's a spiritual element involved. Some commentators try to make it be all a spiritual element, but there was definitely physical and spiritual wrestling happening in this moment. Let's keep going. This is Genesis 32:25. "When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man." So he's wrestling with this man and winning in a certain way. And then it definitely becomes physical, where his hip is touched and wrenched. Now there's different translations that say it could be the hip, it could be a muscle in the thigh, it could be other parts of the body in that area. But something happens to Jacob so that his hip is wrenched when he's wrestling with this man. Now Hosea, a prophet in the Bible, talks about this story. And in this story, even as we continue on, which we will see here, who Jacob was wrestling with is not just a regular old man, or man of any age, actually, just not a normal man. In the Bible, there are times when man is used, the word man, and it means more than, in the Hebrew, it means more than just a human flesh. Like in the story of the fiery furnace, and they're walking around in the furnace, and there's someone else walking around, and it says it looks like a man, it looks like the Son of God. These are things that happen in the Old Testament, foreshadowing what's coming, like Jesus taking on a form that comes to earth before he took on the human form, or an angel in there. So this is not just a standard man wrestling with Jacob all night. Something happens, and clearly who he's wrestling with could not overpower Jacob in a certain way, but definitely had an advantage because it suddenly touches his hip, and his hip is wrenched. So who Jacob is wrestling with is not just suddenly pulls out one last final thing. They are engaged in this battle. Hosea talks about this and says that Jacob was begging and weeping. He thinks he's going to die, that his brother is coming and he's done, that his brother is going to kill him. So Jacob is there praying, and this man is some form of God or angel, and Jacob is begging and crying, and they are wrestling and battling it out through the night. I think that's kind of a hard picture for us to imagine, battling with God. But remember who Jacob is. He's this deceiver. He's been relying on his own strength for his whole life to try and get ahead. Tricks his brother, works with his mother to trick his father. So he's been doing stuff his whole life in his own strength to try and get this advantage. So here he is wrestling with God, wrestling spiritually, crying out to God. And he is crying out and crying out. And this angel man touches his hip, wrenches his hip. Let's see what happens. Genesis 32:26. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob is in pain. His hip has been wrenched, and yet he doesn't quit wrestling. He doesn't, when the going gets tough, he doesn't suddenly let go and say, "Okay, I'm done." He clings on. He keeps holding on and says, "I'm not letting go until you bless me." In extreme pain, I'm not letting go until you bless me. There are times when we cry out to God, and we cry out to God, and we can be in physical pain. We can be in spiritual pain. We can be in emotional pain with all the stuff that's going on around us. And something happens when we cry out to God and we don't let go. When it's hurting us and we don't let go. Sometimes in our pain we think, okay, I gotta get out of here. I got to, this isn't working for me. Seeking God isn't making a difference. In fact, I'm hurting worse. When the going gets tough, God doesn't always just immediately take away the pain. Jacob's hip was wrenched and the guy said, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "No, I'm not letting you go unless you bless me." Do we have that same desire to cling to God, to persevere in our walk with God, to press into Him when things seem hard, when things aren't changing, when we could be in pain? Because sometimes in the pain, we can be changed. In those times when we are pressing into God, despite the pain, through the pain, that's where God changes us. Let's see what happened with Jacob. We are in 32:27 and 28. The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." So this man wrestling with Jacob isn't asking his name because he just thinks he's wrestling some nobody stranger that he met along this river. He's asking his name because he's saying, "Who are you? What is your identity? What is your name?" So much had been caught up and bound in Jacob's name, the one that grasps the heel, the supplanter, the deceiver. The angel is saying to him, are you living up to the name you have? Do you realize what you've been and who you are from your whole life? And Jacob says, "Jacob." And then he says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel." And Israel means one who struggles with God and with man. So in that moment, when the angel or God, however it is in this interaction, changes his name, it's a big deal. His name goes from being deceiver, supplanter, to one who struggles with God. He persevered in this fight, in this wrestling, in this spiritual battle that was also physical. And he didn't let go. He didn't give up. He didn't quit. This persistence paid off. Let's keep going. Genesis 32:29. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. Jacob didn't quit. Wrenched hip, wrestling all night, battling all night, thinking he's going to die the next day when he meets up with his brother. He doesn't quit. He doesn't just lay down and go to sleep. He doesn't spend the whole night worrying. He battles it out in this prayer with God. And he says, "What is your name?" Or "Please tell me your name." This has happened in other times in the Bible where people in the Old Testament have wanted to know, who are you? What's your name? When Moses is going to Egypt and fight on behalf of all the Israelites and speak to Pharaoh, he's like, "I need to know what your name is, God." And God says, "I am who I am." There's a certain amount, if you can name something, that you have almost like authority or power over it. That's how it was in the culture of that time. Like all the gods had names, and when they had names, it was like you could, I don't know, they were making gods out of statues. So that was really easy to make something out of stone and give it a name, and like, this is your household god. So whenever people in the Old Testament are asking, what's your name? It's what they're used to, being able to name something. But our God is like above a name in a certain way. I mean, we know who our God is. But assigning a name like Jacob wanted to here, the angel doesn't give, or God in this form doesn't give. Then he blessed him there. Jacob held on and continued the fight through the pain in his hip, through the struggle all night long. Are we willing to do the same? When we are struggling, seeking God for something, do we fight through? Are we willing to wait on God and seek his face? We talked last week about not giving up in prayer. This goes right along, like it can be a battle where somehow when we are wrestling with God in prayer, that his blessings come. When we are willing to put in the fight, and it's not like we're earning it. We're not earning our salvation. It's like we're showing God our dedication. Like, God, I want you, and I'm going to seek you. And God moves, and God blesses. Let's keep going. Genesis 32, 30 and 31. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Jacob came out of that a changed man. He went in, the deceiver, the supplanter, the one who grasps the heel. Had been working his whole life, kind of trying to make a name for himself in these roundabout ways. And yet here he is, new name, Israel. He is the father of the 12 Jewish tribes. He carried on the promise that God had given to Abraham. So through this wrestle with God, his life has changed drastically. He has been given the blessing, and now he is the one that is starting like all this Jewish nation. So through this battle, when he didn't let go and didn't give up, this is where he is, and this is what has happened to him. That's my question for us. Are we willing to not let go? Don't let go. When Jesus left, he told his disciples, wait. I'm going to send power from on high. Are we willing to wait on God? Are we willing to wait and be filled with the Spirit? Are we willing to wait and receive blessings from God, no matter what? Or when we get tired, we get hungry, we get whatever, and we're in the middle of prayer, do we just step back and walk away? When it starts to hurt, because sometimes spending time with God, there's stuff in us that needs to go. Parts of us that need to be changed. God wants to mold us into his image. And sometimes that can hurt. But are we willing to say whatever it takes? I'm not letting you go until you bless me. Because when it's all said and done, that's what's going to be left. Our relationship with God, that's all that's going to matter. I'm going to ask Dave to come. When it's all said and done, what do we have left? Are we willing to say, God, I'm not letting you go. Do whatever it takes. Jacob had his hip wrenched. His name was changed. He left a different man. Are we willing to do the same? Because it's a very scary prayer to say, whatever it takes. Are we willing to pray that for our loved ones? Do whatever it takes. Are we going to say, God, I'm not letting go. I have this burden that is too big. Jacob thought he was going to die. What do we have that we're carrying and it seems too much? Don't let go.